By the late 1920s, he was already thinking about building a golf course, and he had already set his sights on the property that is now Augusta National Golf Club. And in 30 or 31, he met Clifford Roberts, and together they formed a corporation to buy the property. And then he started the Masters tournament. He did not particularly care for the title of the Masters. He preferred the title Augusta National Invitational. I think he didn't like the Masters, yes, because A, it was pretentious, and B, while Bub would not be said to be progressive in any way, shape, or form, he certainly, remember, he had a real strong sense of fairness. And I think even then he would have had something of a prescient sense of how tough it would be to name something the Masters in the Deep South.
Hi, this is Chet Hurwitz from Atlanta, Georgia, and I play at Atlanta Country Club. This is Golf Smarter number 942.
The Masters and a Bobby Jones history lesson through the eyes and heart of his grandson, Dr. Bob Jones IV.
This is Golf Smarter, sharing stories, tips, and insights from great golf minds to help you lower your score and raise your golf IQ. Here's your host, Fred Green.
Welcome back to the Golf Smarter podcast, Dr. Bob.
Great to be with you, Fred, as always.
As always, it must be April. Dr. Bob Jones IV is here, and it's time for the Masters. So we want a history lesson, as always, and love getting your perspective on all things South in that era. The area.
Yeah.
And the area code. But before we do that, I got to tell you, so we were supposed to get together.
We were.
And we had been talking about this for 8-9 months of getting together. When I came down to Atlanta, I was doing a civil rights tour, and we were going to get together, and you had to be it just last minute stuff, and we didn't get to do it. So this is the first time we get to see each other and talk to each other since then. I'm sorry we missed each other.
Well, Fred, you have to understand the only thing that had us miss each other. I mean, if it had been anything other, well, I'll be honest about it. If it had been anything other than having brain surgery to remove a benign tumor, that's the only thing that could have kept me from getting together with you. So
and your mother-in-law's birthday in Florida.
And my mother-in-law's birthday in Florida.
And crappy weather.
We
were hoping to play. We were going to play golf, and the weather was not worth it.
Yes. So brain surgery, mother-in-law, and crappy weather. So.
And you're not kidding about those things. So
no.
I'm glad to know that you're doing better.
Doing very well. Thanks. To a large extent, I'm doing very well. I was really appreciated the support of a mutual friend of ours, Dr. Joe Parent. So,
oh, really?
Yep. I went back and looked at his book, texted him, emailed him a couple of times. He gave me some good advice, and just a nice guy.
Oh, I'm so glad I could make that introduction.
Yeah, me too.
That's awesome. That's awesome. So while we were there, we met up with a friend of my wife's who she actually went to high school with. And was friend of a friend. You know, they weren't really close, but he's a Golf Smarter listener, and then realized that my wife was his friend from high school. And then Joanne's book came out back in June. We talked to her about that, and he and his wife read the book, and his wife really related to it. So we got together with this couple while we were there, and he was telling me that one of his regular playing partners, he belongs to the Atlanta Country Club, and one of his regular playing partners is apparently a good friend of yours, Charlie Yates.
Mm-hmm. That's right. That's exactly right. I've known Charlie. Actually, I was thinking about that when you asked me that. I was trying to think of how long I've known Charlie, and I think if you were to ask us both, we are of the age where we really don't know how long we've known each other. And Charlie is, his father was for a long time the oldest living member of Augusta National. His father,
and this is why we're bringing up Charlie Yates, because Charlie Yates Sr.
His father won the British Amateur in 1938, and was also a member of the Walker Cup team that year. Really outstanding golfer. And an incredible leader of philanthropy in the city of Atlanta. He was instrumental in the building of the Woodruff Arts Center here in Atlanta. He was also very, very prominent in the development of the Bobby Jones Scholarship Fund that funds an exchange between Emory and the University of St. Andrews in Scotland. His son, Charlie Jr., who is my dear friend, Charlie he would never want me to say this, but Charlie is every bit as impactful, I think, on our city as was his father. He was very big in the promotion of the YMCA here in Atlanta, and also has had a huge interest in the Jones Scholarship, and also in the he's also been active with the Atlanta Opera, which taking it from basically forgettable to being one of the top 10 companies in the United States. And not to mention that he just has a heart of gold and is a good friend. And unfortunately, if he hears this now, he'll get a big head, and he'll just be unlivable. But he really
we
is
won't tell him.
Great guy. So.
It's fascinating because, and we're going to get him on the show at some point, because this history of homegrown Atlanta golfers between Bobby Jones and Charlie Yates. But it was an era when amateur play was far more important than professional golf. I mean, the majors that Bobby Jones won, he won as an amateur. He
did, and he
won the amateur championships.
Well, that's correct. The amateur championships were major championships, and really, all the way up into the 1950s, amateur golf, in many ways, was kind of the equal to the professional game, and that's partially because, to a large degree, there just really wasn't money in the professional game. Or in the amateur game. In the professional.
In the professional game.
Yeah, so there was really no inducement. I mean, if you could make, back in the 1940s, 50s, if you could make $20,000 or $30,000 a year selling insurance, why wouldn't you just do that and play golf on the amateur circuit, then become professional? And then around 1958, 1960, along came a guy named Arnold Palmer. And all of a sudden, there was enough money in the game to where anybody after that point, if you truly wanted to be competitive, you had to consider turning pro to have your game at the sharp level that it needed to be. But up until that time, and in fact, up until that time, it was always customary to think of whoever won the U.S. Amateur Championship as having been a major champion.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Absolutely.
But also, let's talk about the perfect storm of golf, Arnold Palmer television.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
Right? That changes everything, because his charisma just explodes off the television, and Arnie's Army is created because people now can follow him all across the country, the world, by seeing him on television.
It could. And then also you have to add one other thing into that mix in terms of television and Arnold Palmer, and that is you have to add in the Augusta National Golf Club. Now, granted, when Palmer was winning most of his tournaments, actually, the Masters was telecast in black and white. But it was the first time that people had the opportunity to actually see the place. And it was also the first time they had the opportunity to see the drama of the final 4 or 5 holes. Now, the downside to it, back in the 1958, 60, 62, those are the first 3 times that Palmer, and 64, when Palmer won that, is that most of the excitement was already done by the time TV came on, because they only covered from hole 14 through 18, which means that Amen Corner never even got seen. And that's where a lot of what Arnie did was done on holes 11, 12, and 13. So Yeah, so it never even got seen until I don't think Amen Corner got telecast until the 1970s, I think.
Hmm. But
So,
back to Charlie Yates Sr. for a moment.
yes,
He grew up, one of his heroes was Bobby Jones. Correct?
absolutely.
I mean, this is what I was reading about.
Oh, absolutely. Charlie used to always say that he used to love to slip under the fence at Eastlake and go watch Bobby Jones play golf. And he said what was really the most exciting thing was every now and then my grandfather would invite him into the clubhouse to give him what Charlie used to call that great elixir of Atlanta, Coca-Cola. And he used to always say, too, he said, he made the discovery that that the old saying was truly the case, and that is, a man never stands so tall as when he stoops to help a boy. And he said that Bub, as we called my grandfather, would always give like little golf tips. Every now and then he'd have an extra golf ball, and he'd hand that to kids. And it wasn't just Charlie. I mean, Charlie's brother Dan also grew up there, and another Atlanta icon of business, Tom Cousins, grew up in that area. We've had great women golfers, Alexa Sterling, who won the U.S. Women's Amateur at the time when that was the national championship of women's golf. And she won that, I believe, in 1915 and 16. And then I think the tournament wasn't held in 17 and 18 because of World War I. And then she picked it up again by winning it again in 1919, which is really sort of sad because had Alexa been able to play in a women's amateur in 17 and 18 and had won 5 of them in a row, we would probably be talking about her to this day as one of the great women players to ever play. But because of World War I, she's kind of been forgotten. And we've had a hard time because we've wanted, at the Atlanta Athletic Club, we've wanted to introduce Alexa for membership in the World Golf Hall of Fame. But unfortunately, I think that two-year gap from 17 and 18, it's going to make it just a little bit daunting. The thing that's interesting, though, is that Alexa, my grandfather, another Atlantan named Perry Adair, and a lady from Chicago named Elaine Rosenthal used to travel the United States during that same 2-year period during the war, and they raised over $250,000 for the war relief. So Alexa was not without her accomplishments. She later moved to Canada and married a surgeon, I believe, in Hamilton. And that's where she lived for the remainder of her life. She did return to Atlanta a couple of times. One was in 1950 for the women's amateur when it was held at Eastlake. My grandfather insisted on driving down to the train station to pick her up, even though he had to drive with a thing that allowed him to brake and accelerate using his hand because his legs were paralyzed. Wow. And then later she came back again in 1976 when we hosted the U.S. Open. So yes, golf in Atlanta, and we could do an entire hour just on the great golfers, male and female, that have just been in the Atlanta area. No question.
Okay, then maybe next year that's what we're going to do. But we're gonna take a break right now. But before we do, I need to apologize to every listener who's listening to our conversation on a speaker in their house. Maybe they're folding laundry or they're doing the dishes. And you've said Alexa so many times that their digital assistants are going, what? What are you asking me? What are you asking me? So, well, I apologize to that. But when we come back, I have a challenge for you, and we're going to do that right after this. So, Bob, every year, the last couple of years, you come on the show, and I love having you on the week of the Masters to not talk about who's playing and who played and what their scoring is and what they have to do, but we talk about the creator of the Masters, the creator of Augusta National, Bobby Jones, the only one to ever win a true
Grand Slam.
The true Grand Slam. Sorry, I blanked on those two words right there. In 1 year. Bobby Jones was an absolute gift to the game and to help put it on the map in so many ways. And so I wanted to challenge you, and I never do this. I never tell the person who I'm about to record a conversation with what we're going to talk about. It's like, yeah, I got a couple questions. It's just going to be a casual conversation. But I thought it would be fair to let you know ahead of time that this is what I would like to do. And so I wanted to challenge you and say, if you were to create a curriculum on Bobby Jones, and I don't mean be a guest speaker for a class, I mean, if you were to do a semester course or more on Bobby Jones, what would it be? Where would you go? How would you break it up? What would be the topics and the coverage? And so that's what I wanted to do for this episode today. And I just put it out there to you. How do you start that? Where do you go?
I think, well, I have thought about it a bit. I mean, the funny part is, in what department would you situate it? Would you situate it in a history department? Would you situate it in an athletics department? Would you situate it in a psychology department? You could probably cross-reference it any one of those ways and possibly more. I think if I was to do a course on my grandfather, I think the first thing I would want to do is situate my grandfather within his historical context. The first piece to that, I would say, is this. You have to remember where it was that he was born and how he came to be here. He was born, of course, on St. Patrick's Day of 1902 here in Atlanta, in a section of Atlanta called Grant Park. And, but, you know, we say that now, 1902, and we think of Atlanta as it is now, this big, huge, bustling city. It's what now, the fifth or sixth largest metropolitan area in the United States, and with the traffic to prove it. And but back then, Atlanta was a terribly sleepy town. I mean, the city was, as my dear friend Sid Matthew talked about in his great book, Life and Times of Bobby Jones, which was also a great documentary, it wasn't even 50 years after the Civil War. And if you'll remember, the Civil War was not exactly kind to Atlanta. Atlanta was absolutely destroyed during the Civil War, and it had been rebuilt. So he comes into that kind of that post-Civil War culture. And the South back then, at least, certainly less so now, but back then the South had a very strong inferiority complex about it. It was generally considered to be grossly inferior to the much more sophisticated North. Certainly in the golf world, it was considered to be that way because, you know, most of the great golf courses in the Northeast were still very new. We don't realize it, but courses like Marion, Inwood, where the first U.S. Open was, where he won his first U.S. Open in 1923, these were all courses that were founded in 1895, in the case of Inwood, 1901. And they were all basically bent grass greens and highly manicured. The South was played on very, very rough Bermuda grass, which was really slow, which is how the North viewed Southerners, really slow. The Southern people in the South spoke differently. And then there was the fact that the South had lost a war, and it had lost a war that had, whether we like to admit it or not, had been fought over the whole question of whether one set of people can actually own another set of people. And so all of that came together to kind of create this hothouse into which my grandfather was born. Now, he came from a family where his father was a lawyer, and a rather successful lawyer. He would represent Georgia Power, which later became Southern Company. My grandfather would follow up with that, and when he was a lawyer, would actually serve on the Southern Company board. My great-grandfather and grandfather did some legal work for the Coca-Cola Company, and they were very prominent in Atlanta business. But one of the things that was really interesting is I think there were several events that occurred that really affected my grandfather and were very important. And this is part of the historical context. And I owe a debt of thanks to another friend of mine who's a great golf writer, Steve Eubanks, who actually brought this to my attention. And that was, I believe, in 1912. There was a young girl who worked in a pencil factory here in Atlanta whose name was Mary Fagan. And Mary Fagan was murdered. And a Jewish man named Leo Frank was later arrested for that murder and tried and convicted, but ultimately pardoned by the then governor of the state of Georgia. And in Marietta, or in Cobb County, which is where Frank was jailed, Frank was busted out of the jail and lynched. And it was the whole thing was just this nightmare experience. And shortly thereafter, the Ku Klux Klan went and burned a cross on top of Stone Mountain, which is this big, massive, thousands of feet high piece of granite that sits to the northeast of the city of Atlanta. And interestingly enough, what that did was it basically drove essentially the Jewish population of Atlanta, which at the time, as is now, but not to the degree it was back then, just scattered the Jewish population of Atlanta all over the place to just get to basically get out of Dodge. But I think that really affected my grandfather growing up as he did, because he always ended up having a real sense of fairness and what was right. And that became very, very important to him. Interestingly enough, I think also one of the things that really went to influence him in that regard was the relationship that he developed with a sports writer for the Atlanta Journal named Oscar Bain Keeler, who is otherwise known as O.B. Keeler. O.B., even though he was a sports writer, when he was with the Kansas City Star, he wrote a very compelling piece on the sinking of the Titanic. And later, when the whole Leo Frank and Mary Fagan situation came up, it was O.B. Keeler that wrote very, very supportive articles on behalf of Frank, and really spoke out very, very vocally about Frank's lynching, which could have placed O.B. at some personal risk for doing that. But I can't imagine that something that happened at that time would not have at some point been a point of discussion between O.B. and my grandfather as they traveled the country playing golf. So that's sort of the darker side, I think, of the context in which my grandfather grew up. But it was also a time, too, of strong families, of Atlanta as a growing and booming kind of economy. The seeds of what would later become the Atlanta Black business community was being sown back then, which became a very, very powerful thing. So, I mean, it is like anything else, a mixed bag. But I think where I would start then in the curriculum of Bobby Jones is getting him situated properly in his historical context. Because I think unless you do that, then the things that he does later in his life I don't think they quite have the weight that they should have. So that's where I'd start.
Interesting. So during our tour, and again, we had 26 people in our group, and this was a tour given by a gentleman who has a company now for 20 years, and it's always been through the Jewish lens of going through the South. So as we were leaving Atlanta on our bus, he's pointed out, make sure you check there. I see that it says Pencil Factory.
That's right.
So it's still up.
Oh, yeah.
And we heard all about Leo Frank and the large Jewish community that was there and is still there. The temple, which is over 2,000 families, which is a huge congregation.
Absolutely.
And we heard many stories as we traveled through Birmingham, Selma, and Montgomery of Jewish business owners in the South and how they had to deal with what was going on in the 1960s.
Yeah.
And, well, again, much later when we're talking about the civil rights movement versus emancipation and the Voting Rights Act in the 1860s.
Right.
Fascinating.
Well, yeah, I know you mentioned emancipation. Think about it this way. My grandfather was born 50 years after the Emancipation Proclamation.
Right.
So that's how close you were.
Yeah. Yeah. Which is our lifetime right now, less than that. So we have a perspective on 50 years, which is like, wow. Because when I remember growing up thinking, I was born in 1955 and thinking, oh, World War II was so long ago. It was 10 years. And now with this perspective of being someone in my late 60s, it's like 10 years is nothing.
No.
It was just yesterday. Wow. All right, we're going to take another break. We'll be right back and go to section 2 of our curriculum on Bobby Jones with Dr. Bob Jones IV. Our curriculum starts with history. You said it can dovetail between history, athletic, and psychology departments. But I think that the history, it kind of all falls under the umbrella of history and crisscrosses through it. Correct?
No question. And one of the things that anyone who studies history will tell you is history is something that is like one coincidence that occurs after another, or a meaningful coincidence that occurs after another. However, I always like to remind people, and Fred, I'm going to see if you know this. Do you happen to know what the ancient Hebrew word for coincidence is?
Not beshert.
No.
There
wasn't one.
Oh, wow.
In the Old Testament, or what we call the Old Testament, there is no word for coincidence because it was believed that God's providential hand was on every event of history.
Okay.
And I think in that sense, you almost sort of see that same kind of thing happen in Atlanta at the Atlanta Athletic Club in about 1907, 1908. When Jimmy Maiden went to be the pro at, I believe, Nassau Country Club on Long Island, and his brother Stuart came to be the pro at the Atlanta Athletic Club's East Lake Country Club. Stuart Maiden was an irascible man who also was possessed of probably one of the most lyrical golf swings around. And when my grandfather, who at this time was a 5 or 6 year old boy, started becoming interested in the game, Stuart was the one he followed around the golf course. And the way my grandfather learned to play was simply by imitating the golf swing of Stuart Maiden. Bub was 6 years old. By the time he was 10 years old, he was breaking 80 on East Lake, which at the time was one of the longest golf courses in the United States. And he was doing it with balls that were like 40 compression and hickory shafted clubs. And I mean, just with equipment that would, Fred, you and I wouldn't even want to hit a ball with those things.
No.
And when he was 14 years old in 1916, pardon my dog in the background.
No, that's okay. We love having dogs on the podcast.
In 1916, when he was 14 years old, he went and played in the first Georgia State Amateur, which was held at Capital City Club in Brookhaven, and he won it. And at that point, he was invited by George Adair to go to Philadelphia to play in the United States Amateur with George's son, Perry, who later became a good friend of my grandfather's. And that's how he started playing in national championships. And he said the hardest transition, and this is where the psychology kind of plays in a way, he said the hardest transition was from when he started playing in championships, they were just a lark. He thought they were just so much fun, and he would love just getting out there and teeing it up and eating ice cream and hamburgers. But he said the better he got, all of a sudden, he said there was a weight that started to come on to him. And there was a pressure and an expectation that started to come on to him about when are you going to win a championship? And it took him a long time to do it. In fact,
was that self-imposed or that came from the press or
both?
Where did that?
Both. I mean, ultimately, all of that is self-imposed.
Sure.
All of it is self-imposed. But yes, there were external sources to it as well. And also, you figure in 1921, he went overseas to the UK for the first time and playing in the British Open at St. Andrews. He withdrew in the third round. He played pretty well in the first two rounds, shot 46 on the opening 9 of the third round, double bogeyed the 10th hole, which many years later would be named in his honor, and then took 4 shots in hill bunker on the 11th hole and picked up his ball and moved on to the 12th tee, withdrawing from the tournament. Bernard Darwin would write later. Darwin was the great English sports writer for the London Times. Darwin would write later, Master Bobby Jones is just a boy and a rather ordinary boy at that. And that really stung him.
Ouch.
It's very funny. 5 years later, he would come back. And by this time, of course, he'd been a U.S. Open champion and a U.S. Amateur champion. And he would win the British Open at Royal Lytham in St. Anne's, and then defend successfully at St. Andrews the next year. And so he learned in that interval how to get his emotions under control, how to handle his expectations, how to handle the expectations of others. I mean, learning how to play golf at a championship level is not an easy task. Not an easy task. And here he was doing this when he was 20, 21 years old, attending Georgia Tech, attending Harvard, and going to law school at Emory, and getting married and starting a family. So he always worked hard to keep things in balance, which wasn't always easy.
How you say here he is 19, 20, 21 years old, and he learned how to put his emotions under control. Now, there weren't teams of people working with a golfer like they are today.
No.
How did he learn this? Where was his source of education?
Well, I think he had two. One is from O.B. Keeler, the sports writer for the Journal. O.B. used to accompany my grandfather on virtually all of his tournaments. O.B. was a pretty interesting character in and of himself. I'll tell you one time, O.B. had spent an evening in the company of a woman who, shall we say, was not his wife. And the next day she said to him, "O.B., you said you would write a poem about me." And he said, "Oh, that's right. I did say this." And he sat down at the typewriter and he batted out, "My typewriter's most ambitious to ensure your lasting fame, but the liquor we had was vicious and I cannot recall your name." But in 1923,
she must have loved that.
In 1923, he had just gotten into a playoff at Inwood, just right across the bay from Kennedy Airport now, and Bub was getting ready to go play a playoff against Bobby Cruikshank, and Keeler came up to him and he said, Rubber Tire, because that's what he called him. My grandfather's name, like mine, was Robert Tire Jones. So OB would call him Rubber Tire. And he said, Rubber Tire, he said, you are the best damn golfer in the world. And when you get that through your head, you're not going to win one championship. You're going to win a bunch of them. And Bub I think that really startled Bub. He took that to heart, and he went out and won the playoff for his first U.S. Open. But the other lesson I think that taught him about controlling emotion, he was a notorious club thrower because he always believed he was only hurting no one but himself. Of course, we could deal with that one for a while, but we won't. But in 1922, at the U.S. Open at Skokie in Chicago, he had lost his temper and he had thrown a club that bounced off the ground and struck a woman spectator in the leg and busted her leg open. And when he returned to Atlanta, he received a letter from George Herbert Walker, who was the president of the USGA, and I believe the maternal grandfather of George Herbert Walker Bush. And George Walker's letter to my grandfather said, unless and until you can learn to control your temper, your applications for USGA championships will not be accepted. And at that point, my grandfather decided that he would never let anybody be able to tell how he was playing, either good or bad, by his facial expression or his behavior. And that was the thing that really brought about the change. No one has ever found that letter, to the point to where I'm almost wondering if it is not an apocryphal story. But, it's like one of the Italians have a phrase, I don't remember it in Italian, but it translates to, if it isn't true, it should be. So we'll leave it at that. So actually, I just said it, so it must be true.
It must be true. You just said it.
Yeah.
Oh, man, much more history. Post 1921, we're going to pick that up right after this. All right, well, this is not going to be one of those shorter podcasts where there's sometimes I get to a point with a person, I'm like, yeah, I think I got everything I need out of you, so we're done. I got my commercials in. I need to do that. But there's just so much information about Bobby Jones that we love getting. Even though it's secondhand, it's firsthand. There's only 1 degree of separation here. And the amount of research that you've done, the amount of knowledge that you've acquired over the years about your grandfather is just breathtaking. I admire it so much. So thank you for agreeing to do this.
My pleasure.
Mostly. But I want to pick up, so now we've got his temper under control. We've got his realization that he could be that good.
Yes.
And we do know that he has the only Grand Slam, but let's get there.
Yes. I think in order to get to the Grand Slam, there are two golf shots that are absolutely pivotal in getting him there. Because without these 2 golf shots, there is no Grand Slam. And we are talking about Bobby Jones as maybe just this arcane figure from the past. The first one was a shot that he hit on the 72nd hole, on the final hole of the playoff against Bobby Cruikshank at Inwood Country Club outside of New York City. And he was in the right rough, about 200 yards out, with a shot over water to a tight pin to win the United States Open. And he took out a 2-iron, and out of this light rough, he struck this shot that ended up about 4 feet from the hole. It was considered at the time to be the shot of the century. What most people don't realize is, had he not won that United States Open, he likely would have given up competitive golf at that point. 6 years later, he came back about 35 miles, maybe 40 miles from Inwood in Mamaroneck, New York, at a new club called Winged Foot, where he had a 12-foot putt. He had blown a 5-shot or three or 5-shot. I think he blew a 3-shot lead or a 5-shot lead. And he ended up with a 12-foot putt to force a playoff with a guy named Al Espinosa. And it was the most diabolical putt that probably anyone has ever faced. And he rammed it into the back of the cup to force the playoff. The next day, he would go out and defeat Espinosa by 23 shots. It was the most lopsided victory in a playoff in USGA championship history. Had that shot not happened, it is likely that he would not have gone overseas in 1930 to play in the British Championships, and there would have been no Grand Slam. So had it not been for the shot at Inwood, he would not have even continued his playing career. Had it not been the shot at, had it not been for the putt at Winged Foot, he would not have had a Grand Slam. The Grand Slam started, of course, at St. Andrews with the Amateur Championship, and then went to Hoylake, to Royal Liverpool, where he won the Open. And then he came back and then won the third leg at Interlaken outside of Minneapolis, where it was so hot that somebody came up to him after one of the practice rounds and said, "Bob, did you hear it's going to be 106 degrees in the shade today?" And Bob looked at him and said, "Well, thank God we don't have to play in the shade." And so he went out. He went out to play in one of his practice rounds, and at the end of it, he came back in and he went to take his tie off. And he had sweated so profusely during the round, they actually had to cut his tie off with a penknife. And if you see photos of him playing in that U.S. Open at Interlaken, you'll notice he's wearing an open collared shirt because he didn't want to take the chance of having to ruin another tie. And finally, he wrapped up the Grand Slam at Marion, which is where it began just 14 years prior in 1916. Bob always loved symmetry. He was an engineer at heart, and so he liked things that kind of mathematically balanced. And so I think it always sort of appealed to him that it all ended where it began for him, as it were, in national championships. And then after that, he retired. And the question was, what was he going to do? You know, he used to always be asked, again by O.B. Keeler. People would ask him, "What are you going to do when you retire?" And he would have O.B. Keeler recite this poem that was written by Hilaire Belloc. And O.B. would always say, "If I ever become a rich man, or if ever I grow to be old, I will build myself a small thatched house to shelter me from the cold. I will hold my house in the high wood within a walk of the sea, and the men who were boys when I was a boy will sit and drink with me." Well, it's a very idyllic picture, but when you're Robert Tyre Jones Jr. and you really are something of a dynamo, it's not something that's going to happen. By the late 1920s, he was already thinking about building a golf course. And he had already set his sights on the property that is now Augusta National Golf Club. And in 30 or 31, he met Clifford Roberts. He was introduced by the mayor of Augusta at the time to Cliff Roberts. And together they formed a corporation to buy the property. We could do a podcast just on the formation of Augusta National Golf Club. That's interesting enough as it is. And then he started the Masters tournament. Along with Cliff. He did not particularly care for the title of the Masters. He thought it was extraordinarily pretentious. In fact, for many, many years, he would privately refer to it as the so-called Masters. He preferred the title Augusta National Invitational. I think he didn't like the Masters, yes, because A, it was pretentious, and B, I think there was, while Bob would not be said to be progressive in any way, shape, or form, he certainly, remember, he had a real strong sense of fairness. And I think even then he would have had something of a prescient sense of how tough it would be to name something the Masters in the Deep South. So he preferred the title Augusta National Invitational. Finally, when Arnold Palmer won his second Masters in 1960 and did so convincingly and so dramatically, Bub finally gave in and said, I guess masters is probably the right term to use for the tournament now.
The masters of the game.
He gave in, and he was right, because they were at that point the masters of the game. Yeah. Everybody who was anybody had won the tournament. But so even then, by 1934 was the first tournament. By around 1940, it was kind of like, what else was there for him to do? Well, World War II came along, and he enlisted in the Army. They wanted him to play golf during the Army, like he did in World War I. And he said, I'm not interested in doing that. I want a position in action. And so he landed on Normandy, on Omaha Beach on D-Day +2, when the beach was still under some fire. And he crossed the European continent. He started as a captain and ended up as a lieutenant colonel. Started in I believe, the Air Corps, and then went and was in Army intelligence for a long time, for the rest of the war. But then his life would take a terrible, terrible turn immediately after the war. And for all that he had accomplished, for all the books that he had written, for all the articles he had written, the championships he had won, the degrees he had earned, all of that, I think the true greatness of the man actually emerged after the Second World War, when he ended up going through a health crisis that ended up in a very catastrophic diagnosis. When he came back from the war, he noticed that he was having problems where occasionally a foot would start to turn under just a little bit, and he would scald his fingers on hot water because he couldn't feel the temperature, or tingling at the very, very tips of the fingers. And he couldn't quite figure out what it was. He had to go in for experimental surgeries. Back then, we didn't have any imaging that was like we have now. So if you wanted to see something, you had to go in and look at it. And nobody could figure it out. And then finally, I believe it was in 1950 or 1952, he went to New York, and he was given the worst news he could possibly have received from Dr. Houston Merritt, whose textbook on neurology is still the textbook on neurology. And Dr. Merritt diagnosed him with a degenerative disorder of the spinal cord called syringomyelia. It's a terrible disease then and now. We've not really gotten that far along, much farther along in understanding it now even. And it was a disease that would eventually wear him down and put him with 2 canes, and then later in a walker and a wheelchair, and finally in a bed. And yet, throughout it all, while he had to deal with the anger of dealing with that and the grief of losing his mobility, he never lost his dignity as a person. And he bore the illness with such grace that I think to a large extent, the way he bore that disease contributes as much to his legacy today as all of the championships that he won in the 1920s and in 1930. He bore it, at least externally, with some humor. For example, he used to love to go fishing, and one of his cousins was a guy named Charlie Elliott, who for years was the editor of Field and Stream magazine. And Charlie Elliott had a Boston whaler made for my grandfather, because Boston whalers could not capsize. And he had a chair put in the middle of it that would swivel 360 degrees. And they would take my grandfather from the dock, and the dock hand would pick up my grandfather, carry him down to the boat, strap him in. There would be a space for his tackle box on his right side, along with the space for his Coca-Cola bottle where he could put his Coke. And then he could rest his fishing rod in a special attachment on the left-hand side. And they would go spend hours out on the water fishing. Well, one time the deckhand, who was an African-American gentleman, had my grandfather carrying him like a baby to bring him down to the chair on that boat. And he turned and he looked at my grandfather and he said, "Mr. Bob, do you mind if I ask you a question?" And my grandfather said, No. What is it? I mean, what are you going to say? He might drop you in the water if you say no, but what are you going to say? What are you going to do? And so he said, No, I don't mind. And so he said, "Well, I just can't help but thinking, Mr. Bob, how a crippled up old man like you won all them golf tournaments." And my grandfather just looked back up at him and said, "Well, it wasn't easy." And that was it. And
Wow.
I mean, I don't know about you, Fred, but if I were in that situation, I don't think I would have made such a joke. And I would have been probably hurt, angered. But the funny part is, there are two meanings to that. I mean, it wasn't easy because, it would not be easy for someone that physically challenged to win a golf tournament. But when he said it wasn't easy, he was telling the truth. It wasn't easy.
No.
But he bore that illness with incredible grace. I'm often asked, what was he like at home? And the best thing I can say about my grandfather is he was essentially the same in private as he was in public. And when you think about how many public figures there are who we put up on a pedestal, who we later find out, maybe we shouldn't have put them up on that pedestal, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's very rare to actually encounter somebody whose personal integrity and sense of humor and natural humility would really equal his. There was it was Paul Gallico wrote a book called Farewell to Sport. Gallico was a great sports writer. And he said in it was just a scathing book about all the great athletes that Gallico had met throughout his career and all the clay feet that they had. And his last chapter was reserved for the one person who he said embodied everything that was truly, truly great in sports, and only one that he had ever known, and that was Robert Tyre Jones Jr. Not a bad legacy.
Not a bad legacy.
Mm-mm.
That was awesome. Class dismissed. Bob, that was great. I really enjoyed that. Thank you so much for sharing all that.
Well, thank you for asking me, because to be honest, as always, Fred, your interviews are never, they're never just like cut and dried. You always ask me stuff that is so interesting and gets me thinking about things that I really don't think about that much. And I appreciate what you do.
Thank you. And I appreciate you sharing, because it's such a rich history that in history today is so important, and yet it's so hard to get because we're so caught up in the moment.
Yes.
Of everything that's bombarding us on all different directions. But let's just remember what it's like to be on the golf course. Just play it one shot at a time and deal with the process, not the outcome.
That's it. And when that ball's less than an inch off the club face, your job is done.
There you go. Bob, great to talk to you again.
You too, Fred.
And next year, maybe I'll make it back to Atlanta. We're going to do this interview live at some point. We're going to be face to face. All right, buddy. Well, again, thank you for the kind words. Thank you for your continued support. Thanks for the history lesson.
Thank you, Fred.
So early in the conversation with Dr. Bob, I mentioned my wife's college friend whom we met while in Atlanta last month. As fate would have it, that's this week's Golf Smarter ambassador, Thank you, Chet Hurwitz, originally from Brookline, Massachusetts, and now plays at the Atlanta Country Club. You, too, can be a Golf Smarter ambassador, whether you went to school with my wife or not. And once you do, you have the choice of 3 great gifts that include the Tony Manzoni video of The Lost Fundamental, a glove and glove storage compartment from redroostergolf.com, the premium golf club subscription service, and a box of robotically tested premium Flight Path golf tees from flightpathgolf.com. A tee above all. Just send me an email and I'll send you simple instructions on how to call our toll-free listener line to record your show opening telling us where you're from, where you play, and what number episode you are introducing. I'm happy to report that I played 18 holes this weekend, pain-free. You may or may not be familiar with TENS, which is the transcutaneous electrical nerve stimulation. It's a compact rechargeable unit that has small pads connected either wirelessly or wired to specific spots you're having muscle pain. After discovering it a couple of weeks ago, I've been using it multiple hours every day, which is okay, and the pain is significantly reduced in my arm. It's miraculous, actually. Anyway, last Saturday I woke up pain-free, played 18 holes, and even after the round, the pain was minimal. I'm not out of the woods yet, but I'm meeting with another doctor this week to see what my other options are moving forward. But my goal is to be 100% ready for our Golf Smarter Royal Adventure to Northern Ireland this July. I really want to play golf and hang out with you for a week. You know, I've never played Northern Ireland before, and this is a total bucket list opportunity for me. Hopefully it is for you too. But even if you've already played there before, please join me because I'll need some local knowledge. Again, the trip is July 2 through 9, 2024, and we have 5 rounds that include the number 1 course in the world, Royal County Downs, the host of the 2025 Open Championship, Royal Portrush, one of the most beautiful courses you'll ever see at Ardglass, and we'll even play a Parkland course with the oldest clubhouse in the world, Royal Belfast. I've partnered up with TMI Golf, and we only have room for 2 foursomes, but the clock is ticking. You can get the full itinerary and pricing at tmigolf.com/golfsmarter. That's tmigolf.com/golfsmarter. And let me just add that I completely understand if you can't make this trip happen because I sprung it on you so late, but fear not. I've been having additional conversations with Tara Fox at TMI Golf, and here's what we're talking about for small golf groups coming up in the future. How about a couples trip to Portugal? Now, my wife, who doesn't play golf, will host others who don't during our 3 rounds over this 9-day tour of beautiful Portugal. Then next spring, I want to go with you to play the Robert Trent Jones Trail in Alabama. And how about in 2026, we check off another bucket list item with a golf adventure to New Zealand. Yeah. And if you live near there or there, join us. I'll leave a link in the show notes. And about the show notes, we're now using AI provided by our recording platform, Riverside FM, to generate the summary and takeaways for each new episode. So this way you can review what we're discussing before or give yourself a recap after listening to this episode. Now, this Friday is part 4 of our annual series with the late Tony Manzoni. Since Tony passed away in 2018, we've been playing select episodes each year to get back into playing shape for spring. What's different this year is that we're playing every episode in order that we did with Tony between 2010 and his final appearance in June of 2017. This week's episode is called Stop Topping the Ball Forever. Now, chances are you've probably never heard this episode because it was a members-only show in April of 2012, and this is the first time it's being shared publicly. So to make sure you're clear with this, Golf Smarter Mulligans is no longer a separate podcast that you need to find. Now, it's included in this free Golf Smarter subscription and is released every Friday. over the years, one thing that's been consistent with this podcast is that listeners, golfers around the world, enjoy going back into our archives to hear valuable conversations again and again. That's why we now publish Golf Smarter twice each week. Tuesdays are a brand new episode, and on Friday we open the vault to bring you game improvement interviews that are just as valuable today as they were the first time around. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions for upcoming episodes, or need more information and want to discuss our royal adventure this July, please write to golfsmarterpodcast@gmail.com or click on the Hey Fred button when you visit golfsmarter.com.